Sarah Chen had always been the smallest person in any room she entered. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely weighing 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a military medic stationed at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan. Her delicate features and quiet demeanor had earned her a reputation among some of the soldiers as fragile, breakable even. They whispered behind her back, wondering how someone so tiny had made it through basic training, let alone deployment to one of the most dangerous regions in the world. The jokes started almost immediately when she arrived at the base 3 months ago. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a towering man from Texas with biceps the size of tree trunks, had been the first to comment. "Hey, did someone order a kid's meal?" "Because I think they delivered it to the wrong place," he said when Sarah walked into the mess hall on her first day. The other soldiers erupted in laughter, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She kept her head down, grabbed her tray of food, and found an empty table in the corner. But the comments never stopped. During morning drills, when Sarah struggled to keep up with the bigger, stronger soldiers during physical training, Corporal James Thompson would shake his head and mutter things like, "Maybe we should get her a booster seat for the Humvee." Even some of the female soldiers joined in occasionally, though their comments were usually delivered with what they claimed was concern. "Are you sure you're getting enough to eat?" Staff Sergeant Lisa Martinez would ask in front of others. "You look like you might blow away in a strong wind." Sarah endured it all in silence. She had learned long ago that fighting back against bullies only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her work as a combat medic, throwing herself into her duties with a determination that surprised even her commanding officers. She studied medical procedures late into the night, memorizing every protocol and emergency response technique. She organized the medical supplies with obsessive precision, ensuring that everything was exactly where it needed to be when seconds counted. Dr. Williams, the base physician, was one of the few people who recognized Sarah's dedication. "Chen, you've got the steadiest hands I've ever seen," he told her one afternoon after she had successfully inserted an IV into a wounded soldier whose veins were nearly impossible to find. "And your attention to detail is remarkable. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah smiled at the praise, but she could hear Rodriguez and Thompson laughing loudly in the next room, probably sharing another joke at her expense. The truth was, Sarah had always been underestimated. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had been the quiet kid who got picked last for sports teams and forgotten during group projects. Her parents, both successful doctors, had tried to encourage her to pursue medicine, but they worried about her chosen path into military service. "Sweetheart, are you sure about this?" her mother had asked during their last conversation before deployment. "Maybe you could do your residency at a civilian hospital instead. This seems so dangerous for someone like you." Someone like you. Those words had followed Sarah her entire life. Someone small, someone quiet, someone fragile. But Sarah had secrets that nobody at the base knew about. She had grown up with 2 older brothers who were both Marines, and they had taught her things that most people would never learn. They showed her how to move silently through difficult terrain, how to remain calm under pressure, and most importantly, how to think clearly when everyone else was panicking. They taught her that size and strength weren't everything in combat situations. Sometimes, the smallest person in the room had advantages that the biggest and strongest couldn't match. She could fit through spaces that larger soldiers couldn't navigate. She could move quietly without being detected. She could think quickly and adapt to changing situations without the ego that sometimes clouded the judgment of soldiers who relied too heavily on their physical strength. But Sarah kept these skills to herself, knowing that trying to prove herself would only invite more ridicule. The base itself was a constant reminder of the dangers they all faced. Forward Operating Base Phoenix sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Mortar attacks were common, usually happening at dawn or dusk when the light made it difficult to spot incoming rounds. The soldiers had learned to sleep lightly, always ready to dive into bunkers when the alarm sounded. Sarah's living quarters were in a small trailer that she shared with 3 other female soldiers. The space was cramped and poorly ventilated, but she had managed to carve out a tiny corner where she kept her medical books and personal items. Above her narrow bunk, she had taped a photo of her family taken during her last visit home. Her parents stood proudly beside her in her dress uniform, while her brothers flanked her with their arms around her shoulders. Looking at that photo reminded her why she was there, why she had chosen this difficult path despite everyone's doubts. The work schedule at the base was demanding. Sarah typically started her day at 500 hours with medical rounds, checking on any soldiers who were recovering from injuries or illness. Then came equipment checks, supply inventory, and training exercises. The afternoons were usually spent on patrol duties, where she would accompany different units as they conducted security sweeps in the surrounding area. These patrols were tense affairs, with everyone constantly scanning the landscape for signs of enemy activity. During one particularly memorable patrol, Sarah had been riding in the back of a Humvee with Rodriguez and Thompson, along with a new soldier named Private Davis, who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier. Davis was clearly nervous, constantly fidgeting with his equipment and asking questions about what they should expect to encounter. Rodriguez, who loved playing the role of the experienced veteran, was regaling him with exaggerated stories about previous firefights. And there I was, completely surrounded by enemy fighters, Rodriguez was saying, gesturing wildly with his hands. I had to take out 6 of them with nothing but my sidearm and a whole lot of Texas attitude. Thompson nodded along, adding his own embellishments to the story. Sarah listened to their conversation while scanning the area outside their vehicle. She had learned to tune out most of their boasting, but she remained alert to their surroundings. The patrol route took them through a village that had been cleared of enemy fighters several weeks earlier, but intelligence reports suggested that some hostiles might have returned to the area. As they drove through the narrow streets, Sarah noticed something that made her uneasy. There were no people visible anywhere, which was unusual for this time of day. Normally, children would be playing in the streets, and women would be hanging laundry or working in their small gardens. The complete absence of civilian activity was often a warning sign that trouble was approaching. She started to mention her observation to the others, but Rodriguez cut her off before she could finish her sentence. "Don't worry, Doc," he said with a dismissive wave. "We've got this covered. You just focus on staying out of the way if things get interesting." Thompson laughed and nodded in agreement. "Yeah, leave the real work to us big boys." Sarah felt her face flush with frustration, but she remained silent. She had learned that arguing with them was pointless and only led to more ridicule. Instead, she continued her careful observation of their surroundings, noting details that the others seemed to miss. The way certain windows had curtains drawn when they should have been open. The fact that several doors were slightly ajar, as if people had left quickly. The unusual positioning of a few cars along the street that could potentially provide cover for hidden fighters. When they returned to base that afternoon, Sarah documented her observations in her patrol report, just as she had been trained to do. She included detailed notes about the suspicious lack of civilian activity and the positioning of potential cover points. Captain Morrison, their commanding officer, read through her report carefully and commended her for her thoroughness, but Sarah could see Rodriguez and Thompson rolling their eyes behind him. "Good work, Chen," Captain Morrison said. "This kind of detailed observation is exactly what we need. I want you to continue documenting anything unusual you notice during patrols." Sarah nodded and thanked him, but she could already hear Rodriguez muttering something about playing soldier to Thompson. That evening, as Sarah was organizing medical supplies in the aid station, Dr. Williams approached her with a serious expression. "Chen, I've been reading your patrol reports," he said quietly. "Your observations are consistently more detailed and accurate than what I'm seeing from some of the other soldiers. Have you considered that you might have a real talent for this kind of work?" Sarah looked up from the bandages she was counting. What do you mean, sir? I mean that situational awareness like yours is rare, Dr. Williams explained. Most soldiers are focused on the obvious threats, the things that jump out at them. But you're seeing the subtle details that often matter most, the small changes in patterns, the things that don't quite fit. That's a valuable skill. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride at his words, but she also felt a familiar pang of doubt. Thank you, sir, but I'm not sure the others see it that way. Dr. Williams frowned. What do you mean by that? Sarah hesitated, not wanting to sound like she was complaining or asking for special treatment. It's just that some of the soldiers think I'm too small, too fragile for this kind of work. They don't really take my observations seriously. Well, that's their mistake, Dr. Williams said firmly. And it could be a dangerous one. In my experience, the people who get dismissed as fragile are often the ones who surprise you most when it really matters. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. Don't let their ignorance make you doubt yourself. Trust your instincts, Chen. They've been right so far. After he left, Sarah continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that she had chosen a difficult path, and she understood that proving herself would take time. But she also knew that she had capabilities that others couldn't see, skills that might prove crucial when the situation demanded them. Later that night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of the base settling down for the evening, Sarah thought about her conversation with Dr. Williams. His words had meant more to her than he probably realized. For so long, she had felt like an outsider. Someone who didn't quite belong in this world of tough, confident soldiers who seemed to take their place for granted. But maybe belonging wasn't about being the biggest or the strongest. Maybe it was about being prepared, being observant, being ready to do what needed to be done when the moment arrived. Sarah closed her eyes and made herself a quiet promise. When that moment came, and she somehow knew it would come soon, she would be ready. She would show everyone, including herself, what someone like her could really do when it mattered most. The next morning brought news that would change everything for Sarah and the soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that a major attack was being planned against their position. The enemy had apparently been watching their patrol patterns and was preparing to strike when they were most vulnerable. Captain Morrison called an emergency briefing for all personnel. Sarah sat in the back of the room with the other medics, listening as he outlined the threat and the defensive measures they would need to implement. She noticed Rodriguez and Thompson sitting near the front, their usual joking demeanor replaced by serious concentration. This is not a drill, Captain Morrison emphasized. We have credible intelligence that enemy fighters are moving into position for a coordinated assault on this base. All patrols are suspended until further notice, and we're implementing heightened security protocols immediately. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of the situation sank in. This was what they had all been training for, but knowing that an attack was imminent made everything feel different. She thought about her family back home, about her parents who worried constantly about her safety, about her brothers who had prepared her as best they could for moments like this. As the briefing concluded and soldiers began filing out to take their assigned positions, Sarah remained in her seat, organizing her thoughts and mentally reviewing the emergency medical procedures she might need to implement. She was so focused that she almost didn't notice when Captain Morrison approached her. "Chen, I want you to be ready for anything," he said quietly. "If this attack happens, we're going to need every medic performing at their absolute best. I know you're ready for this." Sarah nodded, meeting his gaze with more confidence than she felt. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." As she left the briefing room and headed toward the medical station to prepare her equipment, Sarah passed Rodriguez and Thompson in the hallway. For once, they weren't making jokes or comments about her size or abilities. The seriousness of the situation had stripped away their usual bravado, and Sarah could see something in their eyes that she had never seen before: uncertainty maybe even fear. In that moment, Sarah realized that the coming battle would test all of them in ways they had never been tested before. Size and strength would matter, but so would quick thinking, precise decision-making, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. She thought about Dr. Williams's words about people who get dismissed as fragile often being the ones who surprise you most when it really matters. Soon, very soon, she would have the chance to find out if he was right. The attack came at 0347 hours, just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Sarah was jolted awake by the sharp wail of the base alarm, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. She rolled out of her bunk and hit the floor as the first explosion rocked the base, sending tremors through the walls of her trailer. Training took over instantly. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and body armor, pulling on her gear with practiced efficiency even as more explosions erupted around the base. Her 3 roommates were doing the same, their faces pale but determined in the dim light of their emergency lantern. Nobody spoke. There wasn't time, and besides, they all knew what they needed to do. Sarah sprinted across the open ground toward the medical station, her small size allowing her to move quickly between buildings and obstacles. Larger soldiers were struggling to navigate the same path while carrying heavier equipment, but Sarah's light frame and agility gave her a significant advantage. She could hear gunfire erupting from multiple directions as enemy fighters engaged the perimeter guards. Dr. Williams was already at the medical station when Sarah arrived, frantically setting up equipment and preparing for the casualties they knew would be coming. "Chen, get the trauma kits ready and set up the IV stands," he shouted over the noise of battle. "This is going to be a long night." Sarah moved with purpose, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. She had trained for this scenario countless times, but the real thing was more intense than any simulation. The explosions were louder, the ground shook more violently, and there was an acrid smell of smoke and cordite in the air that made her eyes water. The first wounded soldiers began arriving within minutes. A young private named Jackson stumbled through the door with blood streaming down his face from shrapnel wounds. Behind him came 2 soldiers carrying a third between them, Rodriguez, who was conscious but clearly in pain from what appeared to be a leg injury. "What happened out there?" Dr. Williams asked as he began examining Jackson's wounds. "They hit us from 3 directions at once," Rodriguez gasped as Sarah helped him onto an examination table. "We never saw them coming. They must have been moving into position for hours." He winced as Sarah began cutting away his uniform to assess the damage to his leg. "There's shrapnel all through my calf, Doc. I can feel it grinding when I try to move." Sarah worked quickly and efficiently, her small hands allowing her to work in confined spaces that would have been difficult for someone larger to navigate. She cleaned Rodriguez's wounds with gentle precision, removing small pieces of metal with tweezers while he gritted his teeth against the pain. Despite all the cruel comments he had made about her size and abilities, Sarah felt nothing but professional concern for his well-being. "You're going to be fine, Rodriguez," she told him calmly as she began applying bandages. "The wounds look worse than they are. No major blood vessels were hit, and the bone appears to be intact. You'll be back on your feet in a few days." Rodriguez looked at her with surprise, perhaps because she was the first person to give him any reassurance since he had been injured, or perhaps because he was seeing a side of her that he had never noticed before. "Thanks, Doc," he said quietly. "I mean it. Thank you." More wounded soldiers continued to arrive as the battle raged outside. Sarah and Dr. Williams worked steadily, treating everything from minor cuts and burns to more serious gunshot wounds and blast injuries. Sarah's training and natural abilities proved invaluable in the cramped conditions of the medical station. While Dr. Williams handled the most critical cases, Sarah managed multiple patients simultaneously, moving between them with fluid efficiency. Around 05:30 hours, Captain Morrison burst through the door of the medical station. His uniform was torn and dirty, and there was a wild look in his eyes that spoke of desperation. "Williams, we've got a problem," he said urgently. "The enemy broke through our eastern perimeter. They're advancing toward the communications center and the armory." Dr. Williams looked up from the soldier he was treating. "What do you need from us, Captain?" "I need you to be ready to evacuate this position if necessary," Morrison replied. "But first, we've got 3 soldiers pinned down in Building 7. They're wounded and can't get out on their own. We need a medic to get in there and stabilize them for transport." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Building 7 was one of the most exposed structures on the base, located near the eastern perimeter where the heaviest fighting was taking place. Getting to those soldiers would mean crossing nearly 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire, and whoever went would be operating alone with no backup. "I'll go," Dr. Williams said immediately, but Morrison shook his head. "Negative. I need you here to handle the critical cases. This job requires someone smaller, someone who can move fast and get through spaces that might be blocked by debris." Morrison's eyes swept the room and landed on Sarah. "Chen, what's your assessment? Can you handle this?" Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for her entire military career, the test that would define whether she truly belonged in this world or whether all the doubts and criticisms had been justified. The rational part of her mind cataloged all the risks: enemy fighters, unstable building structure, limited backup, the very real possibility that she might not make it back alive. But another part of her mind, the part that had been shaped by years of being underestimated and overlooked, saw this as an opportunity to prove something that went far beyond her own personal validation. 3 soldiers were counting on someone to reach them, to keep them alive long enough to get to safety. Their lives depended on someone being willing to take this risk. "I can do it, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady and confident. "What's the situation in Building 7? Morrison quickly outlined what they knew. The building had been hit by mortar fire and partially collapsed. 3 soldiers from a perimeter patrol, Thompson, Davis, and a soldier named Martinez, had been inside when the structure was damaged. They were trapped in what remained of the eastern section of the building, with enemy fighters controlling the approaches from 2 sides. The good news is that the debris has created a maze of passages that larger soldiers can't navigate," Morrison explained. "But someone your size might be able to work through them and reach our people. The bad news is that you'll be completely on your own once you're inside. We can provide covering fire to get you to the building, but after that you're operating solo." Sarah nodded as she absorbed the information. She began selecting the medical supplies she would need, choosing only the most essential items to keep her pack as light as possible. She included tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine, IV fluids, and emergency airway equipment. Every ounce would matter when she was moving through confined spaces under combat conditions. Dr. Williams pulled her aside as she finished packing. "Chen, listen to me carefully," he said in a low voice. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. If you don't think you can do this safely, there's no shame in saying so." Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "Dr. Williams, those soldiers would do the same for me. They might not think I belong here, but I know I do. This is why I'm here." As Sarah prepared to leave the medical station, she noticed Rodriguez struggling to sit up on his examination table. "Chen," he called out, his voice hoarse with pain and emotion. "I just want to say, I'm sorry. For all the things I said, all the jokes. You're tougher than any of us gave you credit for." Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "Rodriguez, save your strength for healing. We can talk about all that later." She managed a small smile. "Besides, I've got 3 soldiers to bring home first." The journey from the medical station to Building 7 was the longest 200 meters of Sarah's life. Captain Morrison had positioned covering fire teams to suppress the enemy positions, but she could still hear bullets whizzing past as she sprinted across the open ground. Her small stature worked to her advantage, making her a more difficult target, but she could feel the heat of near misses as she zigzagged between obstacles. She dove behind a concrete barrier about halfway to her objective, breathing hard and trying to calm her racing heart. The sound of gunfire was incredibly loud, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions. For a moment, the magnitude of what she was attempting threatened to overwhelm her. She was one small person running directly toward the most dangerous part of the battlefield, armed with nothing but medical supplies and determination. But then she heard something that changed everything. Faintly, carried on the wind between bursts of gunfire, she could hear someone calling for help from inside Building 7. It was a voice she recognized. Private Davis, the young soldier who had been so nervous during their patrol just days earlier. He was calling for a medic, his voice weak and desperate. That sound erased every doubt from Sarah's mind. She took a deep breath, checked her equipment one final time, and prepared for the final sprint to the building. She could see the gaping hole in the eastern wall where the mortar round had hit, creating the opening she would need to get inside. Sarah waited for a lull in the enemy fire, then exploded from her cover position. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her medical pack bouncing against her back as she covered the remaining distance to Building 7. She could see chunks of concrete and twisted metal scattered around the impact point, creating the maze of obstacles that Morrison had described. She reached the building and immediately threw herself through the opening in the wall, landing hard on a pile of rubble inside. For a moment she lay still, listening to the sounds around her and trying to orient herself in the damaged structure. The interior was a nightmare of collapsed beams, broken concrete, and twisted metal, all shrouded in dust and smoke. "Medic!" The voice came from somewhere deeper in the building, and Sarah immediately began working her way toward it. She had to crawl through several tight spaces, squeezing between fallen beams and around chunks of concrete that would have blocked anyone larger from passing through. "I'm coming," she called back. "Keep talking so I can find you." As she navigated the debris maze, Sarah began to understand why the soldiers were trapped. The collapse had created a section of the building that was completely cut off from the main exits, accessible only through the narrow passages she was currently navigating. A rescue team with larger personnel would have needed heavy equipment to clear a path, which would have taken hours they didn't have. She found Davis first, trapped under a fallen beam that had pinned his legs but hadn't crushed them. He was conscious, but in obvious pain, and there was blood on his uniform from several cuts. "Davis, it's Chen," she said as she approached him. "I'm going to get you out of here, but first I need to check on Thompson and Martinez. Are they nearby?" "Thompson's about 10 feet that way." Davis pointed weakly toward another pile of debris. "Martinez is further back. I think he's hurt pretty bad. He stopped talking about 20 minutes ago." Sarah quickly assessed Davis's condition. His legs appeared to be trapped but not seriously injured, and his vital signs were stable. She gave him a shot of morphine for the pain and marked his position so she could find him again quickly. "I'll be right back," she promised. "Stay calm and try not to move." Finding Thompson required crawling through an even tighter space, one so narrow that she had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her. When she finally reached him, she found him semi-conscious with what appeared to be a serious head injury. Blood was flowing from a scalp wound, and his pupils were uneven, possible signs of a concussion or worse. Sarah immediately began applying pressure to the head wound while checking his other vital signs. Thompson's pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing was regular. She cleaned and bandaged the head wound, then administered IV fluids to help stabilize his condition. "Thompson, can you hear me?" she asked loudly. "It's Chen. I'm here to help you." Thompson's eyes focused on her with difficulty. "Chen," he mumbled, "what are you doing here? This is too dangerous for—" His voice trailed off as he lost consciousness again. "You just focus on staying alive," Sarah told him, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "I'm going to get all three of you out of here." Finding Martinez required the most difficult navigation yet. Sarah had to work her way through a series of interconnected spaces created by the collapsed ceiling, some so tight that she was essentially crawling on her belly. When she finally reached him, she understood immediately why he had stopped responding to Davis's calls. Martinez was unconscious and trapped under a heavy piece of debris that had crushed his chest. Blood was flowing from his mouth, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Sarah's training told her that he likely had internal injuries that were beyond her ability to treat in the field, but she also knew that moving him incorrectly could kill him instantly. She worked quickly but carefully, using her small size to position herself in ways that allowed her to assess his condition without disturbing the debris that was pinning him. Martinez had multiple broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, and was showing signs of shock. Sarah started an IV line and administered pain medication, then used an emergency communication device to call back to base. "Base, this is Chen in Building 7, she spoke into the radio. "I've located all three soldiers. Davis has trapped legs but is stable. Thompson has a head injury but is responsive. Martinez is critical with chest trauma and needs immediate evacuation." Captain Morrison's voice crackled back through the static. "Chen, what's your assessment for extraction? Can you get them mobile?" Sarah looked around at the maze of debris that surrounded her and the three injured soldiers. Getting them out would require careful planning and precise execution, but more importantly, it would require someone small enough to guide them through the narrow passages she had used to reach them. "Sir, I can get Davis and Thompson mobile with assistance," she replied. "But Martinez is going to need a stretcher evacuation, and someone will have to guide the rescue team through the debris field to reach him." "Understood. We're preparing a rescue team now. Can you begin moving the mobile patients toward the exit point?" Sarah looked at the three soldiers who were counting on her to save their lives. Thompson was barely conscious, Davis was in significant pain, and Martinez was fighting for every breath. The enemy was still actively engaging base positions, making any evacuation extremely dangerous, and the building structure around them remained unstable, threatening to collapse further at any moment. But Sarah Chen had never felt more certain of her purpose, or more confident in her abilities. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she had trained her entire military career to do. The soldiers who had once dismissed her as fragile were now completely dependent on her strength, her skills, and her determination to bring them home alive. Sarah knew that every second counted. Martinez's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the unstable building could collapse further at any moment. She had to make a decision that would determine whether all three soldiers made it out alive, or whether she would lose one or more of them in this concrete tomb. "Davis, I'm coming back to you first," she called out as she began working her way back through the debris maze. "We're going to get you mobile and moving toward the exit." When she reached Davis, Sarah quickly assessed the beam that had him pinned. It was heavy, but she noticed that it was resting on a piece of concrete that created just enough leverage point for someone to lift it slightly. The problem was that Davis would need to pull himself free at the exact moment she lifted the beam, and he would have to do it quickly before her strength gave out. "Okay, Davis, here's what we're going to do," Sarah explained as she positioned herself at the leverage point. "When I lift this beam, you're going to pull yourself backward as hard as you can. I can only hold it for a few seconds, so you need to move fast. Do you understand?" Davis nodded weakly. "I understand. Just tell me when." Sarah braced herself against the concrete, found the best grip she could manage on the beam, and took a deep breath. The beam was easily 3 times her body weight, but physics and leverage could work in her favor if she positioned herself correctly. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Sarah pulled with every ounce of strength in her small frame, feeling her muscles strain against the massive weight. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. And she thought her plan had failed. Then slowly, incredibly, the beam began to rise just enough to create a gap beneath it. "Now, Davis! Move now!" she shouted through gritted teeth. Davis pulled himself backward with desperate strength, his legs sliding free just as Sarah's grip began to fail. The beam crashed back down onto the concrete with a thunderous impact that sent dust and debris raining down around them. Sarah collapsed beside Davis, her muscles screaming from the effort, but she allowed herself only a few seconds to recover. "Can you walk?" she asked as she helped him sit up. Davis tested his legs carefully. Both were bruised and scraped, but nothing appeared to be broken. "Yeah, I think so. They're sore as hell, but they work." "Good. I'm going to give you something for the pain. And then you're going to help me with Thompson." Sarah administered another dose of pain medication and helped Davis to his feet. "Follow me and stay close. The path through this debris is tricky." Getting back to Thompson required guiding Davis through the same narrow passages Sarah had navigated alone. Davis's larger frame made the journey more difficult, but his determination to help his fellow soldiers gave him the motivation to push through spaces that seemed impossibly tight. When they reached Thompson, Sarah was relieved to see that he was more alert than before. The IV fluids had helped stabilize his condition, and his pupils were responding more normally to light. "Thompson, we're going to move you out of here," Sarah told him. "Davis is going to help support you, and I'm going to guide both of you through the debris field." "Chen," Thompson said weakly, his voice filled with emotion she had never heard from him before. "I can't believe you came for us. I can't believe you're here." "Where else would I be?" Sarah replied simply. "You're my soldiers. Now save your strength for walking." Moving Thompson required careful coordination. His head injury made him unsteady on his feet, and the narrow passages through the debris demanded precise navigation. Sarah went first, testing each step and guiding them around obstacles. Davis followed, supporting Thompson's weight when needed. The journey to the exit point was slow and dangerous. Several times, pieces of the unstable structure shifted around them, sending new showers of dust and debris falling from above. Sarah's small size allowed her to squeeze through tight spaces and test the stability of their path, but she had to constantly look back to ensure that Davis could manage Thompson's weight through the same passages. Halfway to the exit, Thompson stumbled and nearly fell, his head injury causing a moment of disorientation. Davis caught him, but the sudden movement caused Thompson to cry out in pain, and the sound echoed through the building in a way that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Shh," she whispered urgently. "We need to stay quiet. The enemy might be close enough to hear us." As if summoned by her words, they heard voices speaking in a language Sarah didn't recognize, coming from somewhere near the main entrance to Building 7. Enemy fighters had apparently entered the building and were searching for survivors or intelligence materials. Sarah's mind raced as she calculated their options. They were still at least 50 meters from the exit point she had used to enter the building, and the direct path would take them dangerously close to where the enemy voices were coming from. But Martinez was still trapped deeper in the building, and his condition was critical. She made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had been taught. Instead of evacuating the mobile patients first, she was going to risk all of their lives by attempting to rescue Martinez, while enemy fighters were actively searching the building. "Davis, can you get Thompson to that exit point without me?" she whispered, pointing toward the hole in the wall where she had entered. Davis's eyes widened with understanding and concern. "Chen, you're not thinking about going back for Martinez, are you? It's too dangerous with hostiles in the building." "I'm not leaving him," Sarah said firmly. "He's barely alive as it is. If we don't get him out soon, he's not going to make it." "But Chen," Thompson whispered through his pain, "you could get killed." There could be a whole squad of enemy fighters in here. Sarah looked at both men, soldiers who had spent months questioning whether she belonged in their world, now trying to protect her from a mission they considered too dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she also understood that their concern came from a place of respect she had never experienced from them before. "Listen to me," she said quietly, but intensely. "I'm the only one small enough to get through that debris field quickly and quietly. I'm the only one who knows exactly where Martinez is and what his condition requires. And I'm the only one who can guide a rescue team to him if I don't make it back." She pulled out her communication device and contacted Base again. "Base, this is Chen. I have 2 mobile patients approaching the eastern exit point. They'll need immediate extraction and medical attention. I'm returning for the critical patient." Captain Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Chen, negative. Extract yourself with the mobile patients. We'll organize a follow-up mission for Martinez." "Sir, with respect, Martinez doesn't have time for a follow-up mission. I'm going back." Before Morrison could respond, Sarah switched off the communicator and handed it to Davis. "Get Thompson out of here and tell the rescue team exactly where I've gone. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, they'll need to send someone else." Sarah began working her way back through the debris field, moving even more carefully now that she knew enemy fighters were somewhere in the building. Her small size had never been more of an advantage. She could move through the tight spaces almost silently, while larger soldiers would have created noise that could give away their position. As she got closer to Martinez's location, she could hear the enemy voices more clearly. They seemed to be conducting a systematic search of the building, checking each room and calling out to each other as they moved through the structure. Sarah estimated that there were at least 3 or 4 fighters, possibly more. She reached Martinez and found his condition had worsened significantly. His breathing was more labored, and his pulse was weak and irregular. Sarah knew that he was running out of time, but moving him would require equipment and assistance that she didn't have. Then she heard something that made her heart stop. One of the enemy fighters was moving in their direction, apparently following the same path through the debris that she had been using. She could hear him calling out to his companions, probably reporting that he had found a way deeper into the building. Sarah looked around desperately for options. The space around Martinez was too confined for her to hide effectively, and there was no other route she could use to evacuate him. In just a few minutes, the enemy fighter would discover both of them, and they would both be captured or killed. That's when Sarah remembered something her brothers had taught her during their survival training sessions back home. Sometimes the best place to hide from an enemy was in plain sight, especially if you could make yourself appear to be something other than what you actually were. Sarah quickly pulled off her helmet and outer uniform jacket, then used them to cover Martinez more completely. She positioned herself partially under a piece of fallen concrete, arranging debris around herself so that she would appear to be just another casualty if someone glanced in their direction without looking too carefully. Then she controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, and waited. The enemy fighter appeared at the entrance to their confined space within minutes, his weapon ready and his eyes scanning the area. Sarah could see him clearly through a gap in the debris, a young man not much older than herself, dressed in makeshift combat gear and carrying an assault rifle. The fighter looked directly at the area where Sarah and Martinez were positioned. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he had spotted something that looked suspicious. He took a step closer, his weapon raised, and Sarah prepared herself to fight for both their lives with nothing but her medical supplies and determination. But then another voice called out from deeper in the building, apparently summoning the fighter to a different location. The young man hesitated for another few seconds, then turned and moved away from their position. Sarah remained motionless for several more minutes, waiting until she was certain the fighter had moved far enough away. Then she immediately went back to work on Martinez, checking his vital signs and adjusting his IV fluids. His condition had stabilized slightly, but he still needed immediate evacuation. She contacted base using Martinez's emergency radio. "Base, this is Chen. I'm with the critical patient and we have enemy fighters in the building. I need immediate backup for extraction." "Chen, what's your exact position?" Morrison's voice was tight with concern. Sarah gave him detailed directions to their location, emphasizing the route through the debris field that would allow a rescue team to reach them without being detected by the enemy fighters. She also provided intelligence about the number and location of the hostiles she had observed. "A rescue team is en route," Morrison replied. "ETA 10 minutes. Can you hold your position that long?" Sarah looked down at Martinez, who was barely conscious, but still breathing. She thought about the enemy fighters who were still searching the building, about the unstable structure that could collapse further at any moment, and about the promise she had made to bring all 3 soldiers home alive. "Yes, sir. We'll be here." The next 10 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She worked continuously to keep Martinez stable, monitoring his breathing and adjusting his medical support as needed. Every sound from elsewhere in the building made her freeze, listening carefully to determine whether it was rescue team or enemy fighters approaching their position. When she finally heard American voices calling her name, Sarah almost cried with relief. "Here," she called back quietly. "Follow my voice, but watch for hostiles." The rescue team was led by Dr. Williams himself, along with 2 soldiers Sarah didn't recognize. They had brought a portable stretcher and additional medical equipment, moving through the debris field with impressive speed and efficiency. "Chen, report," Dr. Williams said as soon as he reached their position. "Martinez has multiple rib fractures, possible internal bleeding, and signs of shock," Sarah replied in her most professional voice. "He needs immediate surgical intervention. I've been maintaining his airway and circulation, but his condition is critical." Dr. Williams quickly confirmed Sarah's assessment while the 2 soldiers prepared the stretcher for evacuation. "Outstanding work, Chen. You've kept him alive long enough for us to save him." Getting Martinez out of the building required the same careful navigation through the debris field, but now they had 4 people working together to accomplish the task. Sarah guided the team through the safest route, while Dr. Williams monitored Martinez's condition during transport. They emerged from Building 7 into the dawn sunlight to find that the battle for forward operating base Phoenix was winding down. Enemy fighters had been repelled from all positions, and the base was secure. Sarah could see Davis and Thompson being loaded into an ambulance near the medical station, both conscious and stable. As the medical team took Martinez into surgery, Captain Morrison approached Sarah with an expression she had never seen from him before. It took her a moment to recognize what it was: genuine respect and admiration. "Chen, what you did in there was extraordinary," he said simply. "You saved 3 lives under combat conditions that would have challenged our most experienced soldiers. I want you to know that your actions today will be recognized at the highest levels." Sarah felt exhausted, but deeply satisfied. "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job." "No," Morrison replied firmly. "You were doing far more than your job. You were proving something that some people around here needed to learn." Later that evening, as Sarah was finally able to rest in her quarters, she received visitors she hadn't expected. Rodriguez limped in on crutches, followed by Davis and Thompson, who had been released from the medical station with minor injuries. "Chen," Rodriguez said, his voice serious and humble in a way she had never heard before. "We came to say something that's long overdue. We were wrong about you. Dead wrong." Thompson nodded emphatically. "I've been thinking all day about what you did, risking your life to come after us when you could have stayed safe in the medical station. I keep asking myself if I would have done the same thing if the situation was reversed." "And honestly," Davis added quietly, "I don't know if I would have been brave enough to do what you did. You saved our lives, and you did it after we spent months treating you like you didn't belong here." Sarah looked at the 3 soldiers who had once been her harshest critics and saw something in their faces that meant more to her than any medal or commendation could. They saw her now not as someone who was too small or too fragile for military service, but as someone who had proven herself when it mattered most. "You don't need to apologize," Sarah said simply. "We're soldiers. We protect each other. That's what we do." Rodriguez shook his head. "It's more than that, Chen. What you did today showed all of us what real strength looks like. It's not about how big you are or how loud you talk. It's about being willing to do what needs to be done when people are counting on you. And it's about not giving up on people," Thompson added, "even when those people haven't earned your loyalty." Over the following weeks, word of Sarah's actions spread throughout the base and beyond. She was recommended for the Bronze Star Medal for heroism in combat, and her story became an inspiration for other soldiers who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, or too different to succeed in military service. But perhaps more importantly for Sarah, she had found her place in the community of soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The jokes and dismissive comments stopped completely, replaced by genuine respect and acceptance. Rodriguez, Thompson, and Davis became some of her strongest supporters, often telling other soldiers about the day a tiny medic had risked everything to save their lives. Dr. Williams continued to work with Sarah, helping her develop her skills and encouraging her to consider advanced medical training after her deployment ended. "You have a gift, Chen," he told her one afternoon as they worked together in the medical station. "Not just for medicine, but for staying calm under pressure and making the right decisions when everything is falling apart. Those abilities will serve you well wherever your career takes you." Sarah's parents were eventually told about her actions through official channels, though the details were kept classified for security reasons. Her mother called her a few weeks later, her voice filled with pride and emotion. "Sarah, your father and I always knew you were strong, but we never imagined you were this strong. We're so proud of what you've accomplished." "I'm proud too, Mom," Sarah replied. "I finally feel like I know exactly where I belong." 3 months later, when Sarah's deployment ended and she prepared to return home, the entire base turned out to see her off. Captain Morrison presented her with a unit citation signed by every soldier on the base, thanking her for her service and her courage. Rodriguez, Thompson, and Davis were among the last to say goodbye. "Chen," Rodriguez said as he shook her hand, "I want you to promise me something. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're too small or too fragile for anything you want to do. What you did for us proved that size doesn't matter when you have heart." "And courage," Thompson added. "And determination," Davis finished. Sarah smiled as she looked at these 3 soldiers who had become her friends and supporters. "I promise, and I want you 3 to promise me something in return." "Anything," Rodriguez said immediately. "Promise me that you'll never judge someone by their size or their appearance again. Promise me that you'll give people a chance to prove what they can do before you decide what they can't do." All 3 soldiers nodded solemnly. "We promise," Thompson said, "and we'll make sure other soldiers understand that lesson too." As Sarah's transport aircraft lifted off from Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she looked down at the place where she had faced the greatest challenge of her life and discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. She thought about the 3 soldiers whose lives she had saved, about the respect she had earned from her fellow soldiers, and about the person she had become through her experiences in that remote and dangerous place. Sarah Chen had arrived at the base as someone who was dismissed as fragile, someone who didn't seem to fit the image of what a soldier should be. She was leaving as someone who had proven that real strength comes not from physical size or intimidating presence, but from courage, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for others. She had learned that the people who are often underestimated and overlooked are sometimes the very people who surprise you most when the situation demands heroism. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that belonging isn't something that others give you. It's something you earn by being true to yourself and by proving your worth through your actions. The aircraft climbed higher into the morning sky, carrying Sarah toward home and toward whatever challenges awaited her next. But she was no longer the uncertain young woman who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix 6 months earlier. She was now someone who had faced the ultimate test of her abilities and had emerged stronger, more confident, and absolutely certain of her place in the world. Behind her, the soldiers at the base continued their mission, but they did so with a new understanding of what it means to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. And somewhere in the medical station, Dr. Williams was training the next group of combat medics, telling them about a small, quiet soldier who had shown everyone what real heroism looked like when it mattered most.